Gabor, welcome to the show.
Tim, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I have been looking forward to this conversation for a really long time, and I wanted to make an attempt at least to do it right. So I wanted to have the video and the audio and everything else because I think the work you're doing is very important, and we're going to cover a lot of ground, which I'm very excited to cover because I think it's a real contribution, and you have tools and frameworks that can really help people. I thought we might start with books. And the reason I thought that could be a fun place to start, my audience loves books, number one. But number two, in Tribe of Mentors, the last book that I wrote, or that my guests wrote, you were featured. And I thought that many of the books you mentioned paint a picture of your life experience and also your life's work in many ways. And we can go in any particular order, but I thought maybe it would make sense to start with The Scourge of the Swastika. And that was one that you mentioned had an impact on you, or that perhaps you recommended on occasion. Why is that?
Well, so this has to do with my family's history. I was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1944, in January, 2 months before the Germans occupied the country. And Hungary at that time was the only country in Eastern Europe where the Jewish population had not been annihilated. And now it was our turn. So I was 2 months of age. The day after the German army marched into Budapest, my mother phoned the pediatrician to say, would you please come and see Gabor? Of course, he's crying all the time. And the pediatrician said, of course I will come, but I should tell you, all my Jewish babies were crying. And of course, that's the infants picking up on their mother's terror and stress. And that's how I spent the first year of my life, which has had a huge impact on my development and my lifelong struggles with depression, ADHD, self-shame, and other issues. Jumping ahead now, I knew very little about that history. My parents didn't say much about it as I was growing up. I knew my grandparents had been killed in Auschwitz. I knew my father had been in forced labor, and I never saw him for a year and a half. But beyond that, I knew not much about the details until I was about 9 or 10, maybe 11 years old, and there was a book on my parents' shelf in Budapest with the title The Scourge of the Swastika, which was written by a British civil servant and member of the House of Lords. This man had served with the British Army, and it was the first book published in the 50s that detailed the Nazi crimes. And I climbed up on a chair, took down the book when I was, I think, 10 or 11, began to read it, saw photographs of the horrors of the concentration camps and the extermination details in Eastern Europe. And all of a sudden, I swooned because I got what happened to my family. And that question of how can people do such things to other human beings would strike me every day. And almost every day, this thought occurred to me for years and years and years. And almost every day, I almost got dizzy with the question. So why people suffer and why people make other people suffer, and what is the origin of all that, has been a motivating question in my life. So that's why that book was so important to me.
Thank you.
And I have to say that, you know, my life's work has been motivated by that question. As a medical doctor, I'm always looking at, well, what is it that makes people be the way they are? Why do we become cruel? Why do we become victims? Why do we become perpetrators? What drives us? What kind of insanity covers our basic human nature, which I believe to be good and positive, and what happens to us?
We're going to spend a lot of time in that territory for sure.
Okay.
So you mentioned sanity or insanity. I'm not sure if that's a good segue to Don Quixote, but I'll let you choose the next one. So there are a few that came up, and you described them in brief in the pages of the book, but for instance, the background that you just gave me was much more in-depth. So we have a few, and these are going to strike folks as eclectic. Winnie the Pooh, the Dhammapada, the Drama of the Gifted Child, and Don Quixote. Which one of those would you like to explain next?
Let's go with Winnie the Pooh.
Let's go with Winnie the Pooh.
Yeah. So that was one of the seminal books of my childhood, and my parents would have read it to me long before I even knew how to read. The Hungarian title is Mitzi Mocko, and it was translated. Mitzi Mocko, Mitzi the bear, and the translator is a great Hungarian humorist. So, if anything, the Hungarian book is even funnier than the original English, which is not something one usually says about translations. But what struck me about Pooh, of course, was number one, that there was this bear of little brains who was somehow so much wiser than everybody else. So fundamentally, he found a peace inside, despite the fact that his intellect is just under-functioning. Number one. Number two, there was this relationship with the little boy, Christopher Robin. And there's a passage towards the end of the book where Christopher Robin, I don't know if you know the real story. In fact, there's a movie about it right now. But Christopher Robin's father, A.A. Milne, was a writer, and he bought these toys for his son to make stories about them. And Christopher Robin actually suffered because he was secondary to his father's career. They did not have a good relationship. So these characters that the father made up kind of dominated and squeezed out Christopher Robin's own life. And he himself became a bookseller later on in his life, and he wrote about his autobiography. So there's something about the dysfunctionality in father-son relationship. But in the book, Christopher is playing with his toys, and then he starts to grow up, and he has to go to school. And he won't be able to play with his toys anymore. And at the very end of the book, there's a passage where the book ends with, but wherever they go in the enchanted forest, a little boy and his bear will always be playing together. And that would just bring tears to my eyes for decades upon decades upon decades. Until recently, I had an experience, actually a psychedelic experience, when I realized that there's nothing to mourn because I'm both the bear and the little boy. And I always will be playing, that nothing is lost. But when I read that book, there was a sense of loss. When I read that passage, there was something's being lost. Childhood innocence is being lost. Playfulness is being lost, which resonated with my own childhood because I did lose innocence and playfulness very early in life. So both for the fun and the humor. Then, of course, there's Eeyore, for whom everything always goes badly. And there's a part of me that's totally Eeyore, always expecting the worst, and nothing will ever work out for me, and never mind, leave me alone, I'm okay with my own suffering. You know, that sort of determined victim attitude. that was also very much germane to my inner experience. So that book just spoke to me and made me laugh, and it still does. It's one of the funniest books ever written, and one of the wisest as well.
I'm ashamed to say this, but I've only seen the cartoon. So I know.
Well, listen. One of the sins that Walt Disney is going to be burning in hell for the rest of existence is what he did with those stories, because he Disneyfied them.
Disneyfied them, yeah.
You got to read the original.
I need to read the original.
And you would laugh your head off.
All right, I'm in. I wish I spoke Hungarian so I could read the translation. Which of these would you like to, and we can certainly touch on other books, but so we have three remaining on my list. Mm-hmm. Dhammapada, The Drama of the Gifted Child, and Don Quixote.
Well, let's go to the Drama of the Gifted Child. So the Drama of the Gifted Child is by a German-Jewish Swiss psychotherapist named Alice Miller, who was for 3 decades a psychoanalyst. But she realized that the Freudian psychoanalytic method wasn't helping anybody get better because it ignored trauma. So the Drama of the Gifted Child, the German title of which was Prisoners of Childhood, was really all about the fact that stuff happens to us as children, negative things happen, then we adapt to those things by taking on certain defensive ways of being, and then we live the rest of our lives from those defensive modes. So we're not actually experiencing the present, we're constantly reliving the past from a perspective that we acquired when we were helpless and vulnerable children. And when she says the gifted child, she means the sensitive child. So the more sensitive the child is, the more he or she feels the pain and stress of the environment, and the more affected they are, and the more that shapes their lives. And that book came along for me when I was in my 40s, and I was a successful doctor, and I was a father, but I was depressed, I was anxious, I was a driven workaholic. You wouldn't have known that when you saw me on the job. But inside me, I was discouraged. I had difficulties in my marriage. With my children, I felt they were afraid of me, and they were, because of my rages. And that book helped me understand. It was the first book to help me understand where all that came from. So that was, for me, as for many other people, a seminal read. And really, my whole work since then has been to help liberate people from that prison that childhood often imposes on so many of us.
This book has come up repeatedly in my life as a recommendation, as a recommended book from friends who benefited from it, who are very, certainly from any outward perspective, highly functioning, in some cases, world-class performers in their fields. And I'm, in retrospect, sad that I ignored those recommendations, but it was in part because I didn't like the pairing of gifted child. I didn't want to label myself gifted child. We could certainly psychoanalyze that, but I was like, if this is a book written for people who are in, say, gifted and talented programs or have some God-given talent, for whatever reason, I had a resistance to that, so I didn't read it. But The Prisoners of Childhood makes a lot more sense. Well, to me, anyway.
Well, I think it's a more accurate title, but there's two things I would say in response. First of all, why do you resist your own giftedness? You're clearly gifted. So why would you not want to find out about that?
Don't know.
Yeah, so that's something you might want to consider.
Sure.
Number one. Number two, really what she means is the sensitive child.
Yeah, so sensitive, that would draw me in because I've had... We don't have to necessarily go down this rabbit hole right now, but I've had a number of my friends recently ask me, when did you know you were so sensitive?
Yeah.
And not sensitive in a hyper-reactive way, not in a negative way, just in a perceptive way. And I'd never thought of myself, it would never have occurred to me to label myself sensitive. And just in the last year, I've been thinking about that. So the sensitive child would make more sense, or would be more appealing.
Well, you have to think of sensitive in terms of its word origin. Now, the word sensitive comes from the Latin word sensire, to feel. So the sensitive person feels more.
Yeah.
So the example I often give is, and that can lead to both very positive and very difficult consequences. For example, if I tapped you on the shoulder right now, you wouldn't feel any pain at all. But if you were not wearing a shirt and your skin was exposed, furthermore, if you had a burn on your shoulder, so your nerve endings were close to the surface, if I tapped you with the same force, you'd feel extreme, excruciating pain, even though the external event was no different.
Right.
So sensitivity magnifies the pain that we have. Sensitivity also leads to more creativity. So very often, the most creative people also have the most pain. Which is why so many creative people escape from their pain through all kinds of dysfunctions like addictions and so on. So there's a real link between creativity and sensitivity, and creativity and sensitivity and suffering at the same time. That's the first point I would make. Now, the other thing goes back to what you said about these people that you know who are high performers. Look at that word performers. What does it mean to perform? One meaning of it is to put on a show.
Sure, that's one meaning.
And I would have been one of these people who was a high performer. In other words, looked at from the outside, a successful family doctor, director of a palliative care unit at a major hospital, national columnist for Canadian newspaper, writing medical columns, performing at a high level. And inside, again, anxious, frustrated, depressed, discouraged, and in my personal life, a lot of suffering. So a lot of people who perform well are actually deeply troubled inside. And of course, there's many famous examples of that. Some of the greatest performers, like Presley or Marilyn Monroe, and any number of people I could name, that's what they were. They were performers. And even from themselves, they hid their own suffering.
Well, we are sitting in a venue right now recording this that is now known as LZR. And there is a mural of Prince outside because he performed his, as I understand it, last performance in this venue.
Really?
Before he passed away.
And before he overdosed.
Before he overdosed.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we can certainly come back to this, but part of the reason I wanted to, big piece of the reason I wanted to have you on this show was that I'm in a much better place now for many reasons that may be outside of this interview, but feeling the exact same way you just described.
Yeah.
Outwardly successful, inwardly tortured.
Yeah.
And how do you answer the question if someone meets you and you just have a short interaction? What do you do?
What do I do?
If someone asks you, yeah, what do you do?
I may be self-serving, but somebody once called me a people whisperer.
People whisperer.
I do have a gift for seeing inside, because I've studied. I'm also sensitive, and in some ways, and I've also studied myself very deeply. I've had to, because my life just wasn't working. And as a medical doctor, I've worked with all manner of conditions: terminal diseases, newborns, families, physical illnesses, mental dysfunctions. I spent 12 years working with addictions. I spent time exploring my own and other people's ADHD. And so I work with people to bring out the truth of their experience so that they're no longer prisoners of their childhood, but that they can make a conscious choice about how to live in the present moment, not based on how they were programmed in childhood. But for that, you have to do it in a way that the dog whisperer do, in a very compassionate way. Otherwise, people just shut down and they shrivel up and they protect themselves. So that's what I do. And I know, I also write and I speak publicly and so on, but the intent is always to bring insight and liberation to people.
So I'm going to come back to the medicine, because I'd love to know when your journey into medicine began. But first, since I know my listeners will say, but you forgot the other two books. What about the other two books? The Dhammapada, Don Quixote, in any order you like.
Well, let's go in the order that I discovered them, which is Don Quixote, which again, I read that as a child and then reread many times as an adult. And he's one of my favorite characters. So Quixote is this deluded Spanish small nobleman who wants to revive the age of chivalry and chivalric knighthood. So he gets this broken down horse called Rocinante, and his lance and his sword, and he gets this squire called Sancho Panza on his donkey, and off they go to these adventures. And he does not see reality. He thinks windmills are giants, and he attacks them, and of course he gets hurt. And he keeps getting hurt, because he doesn't see reality. But his heart is purely committed to liberating people, to truth, to justice, to fighting oppressors, to liberating the oppressed. So here's this guy who really wants to do good in the world, and he's just deluded in his vision, but he's far truer and deeper and more human than all the people that scoff at him and laugh at him. So what a great character. And the book is both poignant and very funny. And he's one of the great creations of world literature. And of course, again, that yearning for justice has always burned in my heart, owing to what happened to me and what I witnessed.
And the Dhammapada?
The Dhammapada is the Buddha's collection of sayings, and it begins with basically the idea that we create the world with our minds. He says everything is thought in the lead. So how we see the world determines the world that we live in. So if I see the world as a horrible place, quoting the current president of the United States, then I will be defensive and aggrandizing and selfish because I want to take before they take from me. I want to attack before I get attacked. I'll always be looking out for myself because the world is not to be trusted. So if that's the world you live in, that's the world you're going to create. And the Buddha was a great psychologist in which he recognized that our perceptions shape the world that we live in. Now, what he didn't say, and that's where modern psychology comes in, is that before with our mind we create the world creates our minds. So that the kind of world that we live in is very much shaped by early experiences. Buddha didn't say that. But interestingly enough, when you think about his search for truth, what happened to him? If you read his biography, his mother died before he was a week old. So he's lost his most important relationship. So his life began with suffering. And then he spent all his life trying to find the nature of suffering and how to transcend suffering and how to get beyond it. And this is how he ended up with this particular method of meditation and contemplation and truth-seeking. So that book was written 2,500 years ago, and psychologically, we're still trying to catch up to the wisdom in it.
So let's talk about wisdom, or perhaps science first.
Yeah.
And maybe they're related in some fashion, although I know we'll dig into certainly some things that might be missing. When did medicine enter your life, or an interest in medicine, interest in being a doctor, either of those things?
Well, I've speculated on that, and there's a number of sources. Strangely enough, or not so strange enough, my grandfather, who was killed in Auschwitz in his 50s, happened to be a writer and a doctor. Grandson ends up as a writer and a doctor. So I think part of it was me trying to fill a hole in my mother's life. That was a devastating blow to her. This is not conscious, but I'm speculating looking back. It's not that she ever said you have to become a doctor. It's not that she ever said you have to follow in your grandfather's footsteps. But I think unconsciously I stepped into that role. Number one. Number two, another reason is that as a Jew in Eastern Europe, you had every reason to feel insecure. And my mother never failed to tell me that as a doctor, you carry your profession in your hands. So you don't have to have a business, you don't have to have riches, you just have to have the knowledge. And then you can go anywhere in the world and you'll be okay. Beyond that, healing and making this world a better place and help people lead healthy lives was just an ideal of mine. Then there was egotistical reasons. Let's face it, doctors get respect. They have a role. They have a good income. People look up to them. And they have a sense of authority that I think I lacked in my own life. So it was a combination of unconscious reasons and idealistic reasons and egotistical reasons. But all I know is that all my life I had wanted to be nothing else but a doctor. I always grew up knowing I'll be a physician.
And when you were studying medicine, what did you think your specialty or specialties might be?
Well, first of all, I should say I didn't end up following the dream because in my late teens, I just couldn't concentrate and study hard enough to get through the sciences. I could get through them, but I couldn't get the high marks needed to get to medical school. So I actually taught high school for 3 years. I taught English and history for 3 years. And then I would wake up and there'd be this voice in me, you gotta be a doctor, you gotta be a doctor. And so then I went back to medical school and with a lot of hard work. Already, having been an older student in medical school and being interested in history and literature and the larger picture, I always wanted to put medicine in the context of history, in the context of society, in the context of human experience, not just as an isolated science, but as part of the broader human experience. And I was interested right away in the beginning in the connections between emotions and illness, between social factors and health and so on. So I was always a larger picture person. And so that was with me already in medical school.
So the integration of mind and body as opposed to the sort of Cartesian duality and separation of mind and body.
Exactly. Not that anything in medical school prepared me for that. I mean, in medical school, you just don't get that information at all. But that was always my interest. And then when I started practicing, if your eyes are at all open, you can't help but to see it. That who gets sick and who doesn't isn't accidental. And who gets cancer, doesn't isn't accidental. And who gets addicted and who doesn't isn't accidental. In other words, there's reasons. And those reasons go beyond the individual. And it has to do with their emotional lives and their relationships and the society and the culture that they live in. So more and more over the decades, my own personal struggles and my medical experience showed me that these connections are important.
How did you end up in palliative care? And I suppose for those people listening who don't know what palliative care is, perhaps you could give just a brief explanation of what that is. Some people might think of it as hospice care, which I'm not I don't think are necessarily identical, but how did you end up? What was the road to palliative care, and what is palliative care?
So I was a family physician, and a very driven one, and also have ADD, which means that you want to move around and have different experiences, because you get tired of the same thing. And really, in retrospect, I might say that there's some guidance in all this, but how it occurred was a series of accidents. So I happened to be walking down the hall of Vancouver's major hospital when the current director of palliative care said, "I'm quitting. How would you like to come and work in palliative care?" And I said, "Sure." It took me not a moment to think about it.
He was just looking for someone to grab.
Yeah, palliative care, sure, thank you. What is that? And deeply meaningful work, because when people are facing death, they also come up against the truth of their lives. And if you can face death, you can face life.
In palliative care, meaning you're helping people with the transition with terminal illness.
These are people with terminally ill for whom nothing curative or healing is going to happen in the sense of physical healing. So they need to be helped with their symptoms, with their pain or debility or weakness or nausea. But also you have to help them go through the psychological process of adjusting to a very short future. And the people who get down to palliative care work, the nurses, and then the doctors tend to be a special breed. It's not because many doctors are not comfortable with death. They're not comfortable with not being able to do something to save somebody. So you have to develop a lot of patience and a lot of acceptance. You have to let go of your power to change things. So it's deeply meaningful and deeply transformative work. And you also have to work with a lot of people with multiple different attitudes towards life and death, religious, non-religious, spiritual, non-spiritual, in denial, in acceptance, and all the stages in between. So it was beautiful, beautiful work, and one of the highlights of my medical career. All the same time, I was still doing my family practice.
And when did a focus on addiction or an acute interest in addiction start to steer your medical practice?
So as a family physician, I've always had substance addicts in my practice, just a few. And again, it was an accident. I got fired from my palliative care job. And my argument is that I was fired for gross competence. I was just too damn good at it, but also for gross arrogance. In other words, with my spontaneous and insightful and rather radical, non-traditional style, I could have great results, and often did, in palliative care.
Well, if I might interrupt for 1 second, what would be or might be an example of your approach that others thought was radical, or something you would say or something you would do with a patient that got great results, but that would seem very radical to others?
Well, I would engage them in deep conversations. Stuff would come up that would be painful, but would be transformative. Physically, I would just use methods that had not been proven, but occurred right to me, and they seemed to be helpful in helping people out of pain or deal with issues and so on. Mm-hmm. I was very open and multiple approaches. I wasn't just following things by the book. Mm-hmm. So that was my competence. The arrogance was that I had a very busy life. I was still delivering babies, running my family practice. So I would get into palliative care, and then the nurses said working with me was like working in the eye of a tornado. And other physicians who didn't have my attitude or my particular mindset would legitimately question what I was doing. But I would regard all such questioning as an attack rather than as an inquiry. And I would react like a bulldog who's being threatened. And that's the arrogance. And that's what ended up leading me to be fired. And it was a great firing because, as always, I learned a lot about myself. It took me a while. But it took, and then 3 weeks after I was fired, I got this phone call from a clinic in Vancouver's downtown east side. Now, the downtown east side of Vancouver is North America's most concentrated area of drug use. We have more injection users in this few square block radius than anywhere in North America. So I get this call saying, "How would you like to come and work down here?" And this is 3 weeks after I was fired from palliative care. Had I not been fired, I couldn't have taken that other job. which then led me to the high point for my career, which is working 12 years with addicted population and eventually leaving family practice and doing that full time. So who orchestrated all this? I have no idea, but it was a beautiful progression.
Something that's come up quite a bit in interviews on this podcast is some variation of sometimes you need life to save you from what you want, to give you what you need.
Exactly.
And I think about that a lot. At the very least, it's a pain-relieving lens through which to view events that unfold. How do you define addiction? Or maybe a better question is, what is addiction? And along with that, if you want to tackle it, what are poor definitions of addiction or misconceptions?
Fair enough. So an addiction is a complex psychological, physiological process, but which manifests in any behavior that a person enjoys, finds relief in, and therefore craves in the short term, but suffers negative consequences in the long term and doesn't give up despite the negative consequences. So craving pleasure, relief in the short term, negative consequences in the long term, inability to give it up. Now, notice I have said nothing about substances. I said any behavior. So it could be related to cocaine, crystal meth, heroin, fentanyl, marijuana, nicotine, alcohol, whatever. Could also be sex, gambling, internet, relationships, shopping, eating, work, extreme sports, working out, pornography, any number of human activities. So I said any behavior. Now, the official definition of addiction, according to the American Society for Addiction Medicine, is that this is it's a primary brain disorder. It arises in the brain, largely due to genetic reasons. This is how they see it. And I say that's just not true. The other popular idea about addiction is that it's a choice that somebody makes, that people choose to be addicted, which is what the legal system is based on. Because if people are not choosing, what are we punishing them for? So although I think the medical definition is closer to the truth, I don't see it as it's a genetic disorder, and I don't see it as a primary brain disorder. So let me perhaps show you why, if that's okay. So I've given you this definition of addiction. Again, craving relief, pleasure short-term, negative consequence long-term, inability to give it up. Would you be willing to tell me if you've ever had an addiction in your life? I don't care to what. I'm not asking what.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I can say yes, and I can tell you exactly what it was.
Okay.
So in high school, I suffered from what I suppose most people would consider depressive periods beginning at latest age 10.
Right.
And never found relief from that until I was competing in wrestling very seriously in high school, all throughout high school. And an older teammate introduced me to ephedrine. So ephedrine,
a stimulant.
Ephedrine hydrochloride, which for those people who are curious, is, well, at least at one point, ephedrine was found, or at the very least pseudoephedrine, in something called primatene mist used for asthma.
Right.
And I think they also mixed it with guaifenesin. Nonetheless, the reason you cannot buy, in many places, large amounts of primatene mist is because people freebased it into methamphetamine.
That's right.
So you have ephedrine, which is a very strong stimulant, combined with caffeine and aspirin. And when you combine those three, it's not an incremental increase in effect. It's probably logarithmic. It's a very synergistic effect.
Exponential, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he was recommending it for increased endurance, and there is some effect, although it's also very highly thermogenic, which wasn't good for me. So it made me really hot, which was already a weakness of mine. But it ended up providing me with relief. It was a very strong stimulant, and I began to not only use it for sports, but self-medicate using it.
Okay, so great. So let me quickly ask you, what did it do for you? Relief from what?
It made me, or at least contributed to, euphoria, optimism, energy. So I didn't feel the symptoms of what in retrospect I would call depression, the lethargy, the pessimistic lens through which I viewed things,
Fair enough.
it seemed to magically just erase all of that in about 30 minutes.
So euphoria literally means a good feeling. It gave you energy. It made you feel good. It made you optimistic.
Also improved sports performance, right?
I'm sure it did.
Yeah.
Are those good things or bad things? To feel optimistic.
Those are all good things.
Okay. In other words, the addiction wasn't your primary problem. Mm-hmm. Your primary problem was that you were depressed,
right?
That you lacked a sense of well-being, that you lacked energy.
Right.
So in other words, the addiction is not the primary problem. It's an attempt to solve a problem.
Right.
And then the real question is, how did the problem arise?
Right.
In other words, this is where my theory is that it's always rooted in childhood trauma, and that the addiction is an attempt to deal with the effects of childhood trauma, which it does temporarily, while it creates even more problems in the long term.
Right.
I would have one more side question for you, given that a stimulant was your drug of choice. This may not be true for you, but do you think, in retrospect, you might have had ADHD as a kid?
Quite possibly.
So, because typically people with ADHD self-medicate with stimulants.
Yeah,
because how we treat ADHD now, we give people stimulants.
Yeah, Ritalin, methylphenidate.
So a lot of the people that choose stimulants as self-medication, like nicotine and caffeine and crystal meth and ephedrine, are actually self-medicating ADHD.
So it's very likely.
Yeah.
And I was punished by teachers for, I wouldn't say not paying attention, but being interested in other things in class. So I remember very distinctly my kindergarten teacher. I'll name her by name because it's shameful. Mrs. Bevan. I refused to learn the alphabet because she wouldn't give me a good reason why I needed to learn the alphabet. It was just, you need to learn the alphabet. So she made me eat soap in front of the class and put me at the bad table. She got rid of the bad table, but I was always interested in doing many, many, many things. And in fact, one of the reasons that I started wrestling was because I was very hyperactive. And as I believe the story goes, other mothers recommended to my mom that she put me into something called kiddie wrestling to drain my batteries before I got home. So that makes perfect sense. I've never been drawn to depressants, never been drawn to opiates. In fact, after surgeries, I get very sick if I'm given Vicodin or anything like that. So I've opted out. I've never personally had any issues with alcohol, although a lot of people do. It's always been a draw to stimulants. Yeah. And once we don't have to go down this path because I want you to be able to focus on these definitions. But where I got myself into trouble was having never been physically addicted to any substance before. I started using the ECA stack once a day. My friend was using it twice a day. I started using it twice a day. Then I started using it 3 times a day. And you develop a tolerance very quickly.
Right. So you have to take more and more.
And if you stop, the withdrawal symptoms are awful. So I had never experienced that. So I continued after sports to use this. And certainly in the long term, there are some very nasty side effects.
Of course.
But I didn't stop. I mean, for many, many years.
Well, so there's a great link between ADD and addictions, and not just because they both begin with the same 3 letters. And I can tell you about my own ADHD. And this is where we go back to childhood again. So that tuning out, that absent-mindedness, that desire to scatter your attention all over the place, that's not a disease. They say it's an inherited disease. The hell it is. That tuning out, that divided attention is actually... But let me give you a personal question again. If I were to become abusive towards you right now, verbally or otherwise, what would be your options right now?
I could ignore.
But that's not what you would do first, is it?
Not likely. I mean, right now, I would probably just listen and pause. I shut down often if I get attacked verbally because I don't want to respond with rage, which has historically been my response.
I hear you, but let's get a bit more basic about it. The rational response, if I were to become abusive, would be for you to just assert yourself, saying, "Don't talk to me that way."
Right.
Or it would be to leave, saying, "This interview is over." And if for some reason you had not the strength to do either of those, there's other people in the room here with us, you could ask for help.
Right.
But what if you couldn't escape, fight back, or seek help? Then you would shut down or tune out.
Right.
In other words, the tuning out is simply a defensive response on the part of the brain. Now put me back into my infancy, where my mother is so grief-stricken that I'm crying because she's in pain. And I'll read you a quote here, if I may.
Yes, please.
And this has to do with the sensitive child. The child is very open and can feel the pain and suffering going on in its immediate environment. The child is aware of his own body and can also feel the tension, rigidity, and pain in the body of the mother or of anyone else he's with. If the mother is suffering, the baby suffers too. The pain never gets discharged. The organism does not develop the confidence that it can regulate itself, that things will happen the way they should. Hence, lack of optimism. Okay, now, my mother didn't abuse me. She did her best to look after me, but she was stressed, depressed, terrorized, grief-stricken. I'm picking that up as a sensitive infant. Can I fight back, change the situation, or escape?
No.
None of those. What can I do? Nothing I can do. My brain will tune out as a way of dealing with the stress. So I'm not talking about abuse here. I'm just talking about stress mothering or parenting. The child's brain then will tune out. When is the child's brain tuning out? When the brain is developing. So the tuning out then becomes programmed in as the default setting. And that's why ADD. So it's not an inherited disease. It's not a disease at all. It begins as a coping mechanism, which then gets programmed into the brain. And as a lot of these early coping mechanisms function, they help you in the short term create problems in the long term. And that's ADD is one of these examples. And of course, it also makes you more prone to be addicted, because now when you tune out, life becomes less interesting. You shut down emotionally, you protect yourself. Now you feel depressed. What does depression actually mean? You said you were depressed. What does depression mean? To depress something is to push it down. What do people push down in depression? They push down their emotions. Yeah. Why would they? Because the emotions are too painful. So even depression becomes as a coping mechanism. You push it down so you don't feel the pain. But then later on, that interferes with your life functioning. So it all begins as a coping mechanism, and later on becomes a source of dysfunction. And all this is happening when the brain is actually developing, which we can talk about later. So these are the links I began to make, including after I was diagnosed with it. So and then despite the fact that a couple of my kids were diagnosed, I knew that this wasn't a genetic disease, that what it is actually is a coping mechanism which got programmed into the brain. And then when I read the literature on brain development, wow, turns out that the human brain is shaped by the environment, and particularly by the adult-child relationships. And so it all began to make perfect sense to me.
So there are a few things I'd love to underscore or reiterate, because I think they're very astute and very helpful. And certainly, if I had had some of these reframes, I think that I would have been able to be proactive with working on a lot of my own issues much, much earlier.
Mm-hmm. Me too, by the way.
Yeah. For instance, we can come back to this. I'm actually just going to mention two things, and then we can go where that takes us. But the first is, rather than asking why the addiction, asking why the pain. Right?
Exactly.
So instead of looking at the consequences, looking at the causes.
Yeah.
And not confusing the symptoms with the causes. So instead of asking why the addiction, asking why the pain. And the other, this might take a moment for me to read, but I think it's worth reading. And I should say that Compassion for Addiction, this is an organization co-founded by yourself and Vicky. I'm going to make a guess. I've never actually said her last name, but Dulai. Vicky, just for context for folks who are wondering, was actually the very first person about 5 years ago to recommend that we meet. And I took a note of it in a notebook I still have. And that's part of the reason that I reached out for the book. And just because we may revisit this, I met Vicky at a gathering at the home of someone named George Sarlo.
Right.
Who has a lot, who shares a lot of common background with you, and certainly common interests. But we'll come back to that. The part that I wanted to read is the following, and I'm going to make an attempt here. All right. So the mainstream view of addiction, you mentioned this, compared to the clinical perspective, is that addiction is a matter of individual choice, moral failure, or weakness, which is why so many approaches are based on deterrence and punishment, which includes self-help approaches, for that matter, that I've attempted myself. The clinical view is that addiction is a disease of the brain with disordered brain circuits and behaviors, an accurate yet narrow perspective. So I think that's a really important line, an accurate yet narrow perspective. So perhaps accurate but incomplete, right? It is accurate that the addicted brain is demonstrably a physiologically dysfunctional brain, but narrow because it seeks to explain the dysfunction in strictly physiological and biochemical terms without recognizing the emotional and social component of how the brain works. And this was really driven home for me recently. In the last several years, I've gotten to know Tony Robbins.
Yes.
And I attended an event not too long ago with several of my very close friends called Date with Destiny. And at this event, he asked the audience of about 5,000 people, how many people here know someone who takes antidepressants? Pretty much every hand goes up. How many people here know someone who takes antidepressants yet is still depressed? And it was probably 80% of the people who raised their hands the first time. And I personally know quite a few people who take antidepressants, which seem to help on some level, although the tolerance for some of these pharmaceuticals can also be developed very quickly. And yet, if my experience is anything like the experience of, or I should say, if the experiences of other people is anything like my personal experience with friends, let's say, who have depression, you witness these thought patterns and verbal patterns that can take them from the highest high or just a baseline of optimism and drive them back into depression. And so it seems to be, just from an empirical or observational standpoint, more to the story, right? So I really appreciate you putting into words what I've grasped to try to understand and also convey. So with this definition of addiction, how do you work with patients?